My husband yelled in shock when he found out that I could not inherit my father's estate. What? You can't inherit the property? I have no use for you anymore. I want a divorce right now. After that, I got my revenge on my husband and my sister, who remarried soon after. My name is Nicole, a 32-year-old office worker. And I've been married to my husband Steve for 2 years. I met Steve through a relative's introduction. My family was somewhat wealthy, but since I only had my sister Jenny as a sibling, our relatives worried about an heir and introduced Steve, saying he would be a suitable son-in-law. Although Steve never became an adopted son after marrying me, he started living with my family. My mother had passed away a few years ago, so it was just my father, my husband, and me living in the family home. Steve was very kind and treated my father well, seeming like a good person. But a relative who had introduced him to me said something concerning just before we got married. I know it's strange to say this after I introduced Steve, but be careful. He tends to be fixated on money. Despite this warning, as our wedding approached and everything was set, I didn't see any signs of Steve being obsessed with money, so we got married. Even after marrying, I kept an eye on Steve due to the relative's words. But he didn't seem overly concerned with money. However, he did seem curious about my father's wealth, casually asking about it during evening drinks. Since my father spoke openly about it, I didn't worry too much. Another thing Steve seemed interested in was my sister Jenny. Jenny, 5 years younger than me, was the opposite of my calm demeanor, bright and active, with flashy relationships. She was also more beautiful than me, which surprised Steve when he first saw her. Your sister Jenny has a very different vibe from you, doesn't she? Seeing Steve enamored with my beautiful sister while I was plain and unremarkable was complicated. But it seemed the relative who introduced me to Steve was concerned that without me getting married, there would be no one to inherit the family home, especially with a beautiful sister like Jenny around. Later, I understood why the relative was worried. My father doted on Jenny, sending her to university and then to a vocational school, not because she had a specific goal, but simply because she didn't want to work. My mother, on the other hand, was strict with Jenny, urging her to get a job after university. But after my father overruled my mother and sent Jenny to vocational school, she ended up getting remarried soon after. She only worked for half a year before quitting. I couldn't showcase my talents at that company. My mother and I were astounded by her excuse. However, my father believed her and quickly arranged for her to work at another company. After a while at this new job, my mother fell ill and was hospitalized. Jenny began skipping work to visit her daily, eventually quitting to take care of our mother. Her care was mostly just sitting in the room, chatting or looking at her smartphone. I had to handle all of the practical aspects, like laundry, as Jenny wasn't really helping. While my mother may have been happy to have someone to talk to initially, about a month after her hospitalization, her condition worsened to the point where she couldn't even speak. Within 2 weeks of her condition deteriorating, my mother passed away. The suddenness of it all left my father and sister Jenny in shock. Unable to prepare for the funeral, I had to take care of it. Thankfully, our relatives were very supportive, and with their help, we were able to properly say goodbye to my mother. After her death, Jenny started working part-time and moved out of our family home to live on her own. She couldn't cover her rent with her earnings, so my father helped with rent and utilities. She spent her money on leisure. My father had been stricter with allowances when my mother was alive, but now he gave Jenny as much as she wanted. Even after I married Steve and we lived with my father, he continued giving Jenny allowances. I didn't realize at the time, but Jenny also asked Steve for money, which he gave her secretly, telling her to keep it from me. It seems that Steve couldn't refuse my beautiful sister Jenny when she asked for things, telling her to keep it a secret from me. He said, "Don't tell Nicole about the allowance I gave you. She might get jealous if she finds out." Jenny would go to her part-time job whenever she felt like it and lived off the money she received from our father and Steve. However, such a lifestyle couldn't last forever. The change came when our father fell ill and had to be hospitalized. While I managed to visit the hospital and take care of him in between work, my sister Jenny never showed up at the hospital. Instead, she called me, demanding money. Dad used to give me money every month, so you should too. All my bills are paid from his account. I was shocked and angered that she cared more about her finances than our father's health. I wanted to hang up, but realizing she was in trouble, I helped her out. I asked her how much our father gave her monthly. "How much did Dad give you every month? You should find a job and live off your earnings." Jenny replied irritably, Stop nagging! He gave me $1,000 a month, not including rent. Her bragging about the amount disgusted me. If she received that much regularly, it's no wonder she had no incentive to work. I had assumed my father would recover soon, and didn't see the harm in giving Jenny money temporarily. But then, my father's condition suddenly worsened, and I urgently contacted our relatives, shocked by the doctor's grave prognosis. During that time, I wished for my husband's support, but he was too busy with work to visit the hospital often. Moreover, when Steve did visit, he would ask me insensitive questions like, "The inheritance from your father must be huge, right? Since it's just you and your sister, you'll split it in half, won't you?" I was speechless at my husband's constant talk about inheritance. It made me realize what my relative meant when he said Steve was particular about money. And I began to feel disgusted with him. When I told Jenny over the phone that our father was in a critical condition, she was only concerned about her monthly allowance. "Never mind that. Just make sure you keep paying me every month. I can't live without that money." The call ended abruptly. I was furious at Jenny's response. But what also bothered me was a faint male voice I heard in the background of the call. It sounded familiar, and I had a bad feeling about it. About a month later, my father passed away. But neither Jenny nor Steve were there in his final moments. Having gone through my mother's funeral, I realized how heavy the burden of funeral preparations was. To make things worse, neither Steve nor Jenny offered any help. And Jenny didn't even attend the funeral. Steve showed up for the funeral, but left immediately afterward, claiming he had work. A relative who had introduced me to Steve noticed his absence and asked me about it. "Where's your husband?" It's odd for the husband, the chief mourner, to be missing, isn't it? All I could do was respond with a wry smile. He said he was busy with work and had to leave. The relative sighed upon hearing this, and I felt like sighing too. After the funeral, when I finally had a moment to breathe, Steve asked me with a smirk, "Finally, huh? How much did you inherit? Even if you split it with your sister, it must be a substantial amount, right?" It seemed that just as the relative had warned me before marriage, Steve's mind was completely occupied with thoughts of my father's inheritance. Disappointed to see his true nature, I replied nonchalantly, "Jenny gets $10 million, and I get nothing." The legal processes hadn't even started yet, and I had barely finished the funeral arrangements. Seeing Steve's excitement over the inheritance talk, I felt like laughing in anger. Believing my words, Steve immediately yelled, "What? You're not getting any inheritance? You're useless to me then." I felt the same way, so I retorted, "Let's do that. You married me for my father's inheritance in the first place. I'll gladly divorce you." With that, I thrust the divorce papers I had prepared at him. Steve seemed a bit flustered, but he signed them. After signing the divorce papers, Steve left the house saying, "I'll divorce you, who gets nothing, and remarry your sister Jenny to get the $10 million. I immediately went to the city hall to submit the divorce papers. I was relieved to be rid of such a terrible husband. The very next day, my ex-husband submitted his marriage registration with Jenny. A few days later, he called me, still believing the story. "Get on with the inheritance process already," he yelled. I had been waiting for this call from my ex-husband. I didn't want to contact him since he had left on his own. I replied to him in a businesslike tone, "Let's discuss this at our house next Sunday. I'll prepare everything for the meeting." Thinking he would receive the inheritance, my ex-husband happily hung up. But I was looking forward to seeing his reaction when he learned the truth. On the weekend, my ex-husband and Jenny came to my parents' house. Surprised to see that I had called a lawyer, my ex-husband spoke as if he had expected it. "I guess when inheriting such a large amount, a lawyer is necessary," he said. Then the lawyer, with a puzzled look, began speaking to Steve. "There's talk of inheritance, but first, there's a matter of the compensation claim against you from your ex-wife." The lawyer showed him several photos. They were pictures of my ex-husband leaving Jenny's house, clearly dated. The lawyer addressed my ex-husband, "These are evidence photos of your affair before the divorce was finalized. You will have to pay compensation." I had asked the lawyer to investigate my husband's infidelity. After hearing him discuss the inheritance over the phone with Jenny, perhaps they were careless because I was busy with my father's funeral. But my ex-husband and Jenny were meeting at our house almost every day, allowing us to gather ample photographic evidence. The topic quickly shifted from inheritance to compensation, leaving both my ex-husband and Jenny dumbfounded. However, my ex-husband soon retorted, "Compensation is nothing compared to the $10 million inheritance. I'll pay it off right away." He signed the compensation claim documents presented by the lawyer with an air of arrogance. After confirming his signature, I said to my ex-husband, "Enjoy your life with Jenny, who inherits nothing. You've signed it, so make sure to pay the compensation." The moment they heard that Jenny would not receive any inheritance, she screamed, "What do you mean my inheritance is 0? I'm supposed to get 10 million. My ex-husband turned red with anger. "There's no way the inheritance is 0. I won't allow you to keep it all to yourself," he shouted. The lawyer calmly began to explain to the angry pair, "Jenny is actually the stepdaughter of your recently deceased father. She was born to your late mother from a previous marriage. There was no formal adoption, so legally, there is no parent-child relationship. Therefore, Jenny cannot inherit anything from your father." I also explained to my confused sister, "Jenny, you're not legally Dad's daughter, so you don't get any inheritance. Jenny was only about a year old when our parents got remarried, so she probably doesn't remember, but I remember it clearly. I was 6 years old when our parents remarried, and I recall being happy to suddenly have a sister. Never did I imagine that this sister would steal my husband. Our parents, each with a young child, were struggling, and someone suggested that it would be best for them to remarry. My mother always treated me like her own daughter, and my father cherished Jenny. Perhaps he was extra attentive to her because she wasn't his biological daughter. Both parents remarried with children, but since my father was wealthy, there were suspicions that my mother was after his money. That's why she refused to legally adopt Jenny as her daughter. The reason relatives were always suggesting matches for me was that they knew I was the only one who could inherit my father's wealth. If my parents had had children together, things might have become more complicated, but fortunately or unfortunately, they didn't have any more kids. Perhaps they chose not to have children to avoid future inheritance disputes. Now I understand why my father continued to financially support Jenny even after she became an adult. Legally, I wasn't my mother's child either, since we didn't go through a formal adoption. But it never mattered in our daily life. It seemed that our parents had never told Jenny about their remarriage. And she only learned the truth today. My ex-husband seemed to grasp the situation immediately, his face turning from red to pale. He was upset that he wouldn't get Jenny's expected inheritance and had already signed the compensation documents. With a blue face, he asked me, "Was what you said, Jenny gets 10 million and I get nothing, a lie?" Trying to hold back my laughter, I replied, "Of course it was a lie. It was payback for you cheating on me behind my back. Besides, there's no way Dad had a $10 million inheritance. Even my wealthy father didn't have that much." Suddenly, Jenny, who had been quiet, started yelling. I was counting on Dad's inheritance and have spent quite a bit. What about the money Dad used to give me? She looked at me with a fearful expression. "You're married now. You don't need it anymore, right? Let Steve take care of you." Jenny looked at Steve, who was still pale, and he shook his head in response. "I don't have the means to do that. I spent a lot expecting the inheritance, and now I have to pay compensation. I can barely take care of myself." Then, suddenly, he knelt down in front of me, begging for forgiveness. "Nicole, I'm sorry. It was all my fault. Please, can we get back together?" The lawyer, preparing to leave, laughed at this sight. Steve's earlier arrogant attitude was gone, replaced by a comical figure kneeling in front of me. After the discussion, my ex-husband and Jenny left dejectedly, and they apparently got divorced soon after. It seems my ex-husband, who had remarried Jenny for her inheritance, lost interest in her when he realized there was no money. Even though I had mentioned it, I couldn't take care of Jenny with the compensation I had to pay for my ex-husband, who had no assets. So, the lawyer suggested we arrange for the compensation to be paid in installments from his monthly salary. This way, there was no risk of missing any payments. Jenny, now without our father's financial support, reluctantly started working daily in part-time jobs. But she couldn't manage her debts and eventually declared bankruptcy. She moved out of her apartment soon after and disappeared. I don't know where she went. Our father, by spoiling Jenny, had made her incapable of working seriously. Now living alone in the family home, relatives have started suggesting marriage prospects again, but I declined. After my experience with my ex-husband, I'd rather find a partner on my own.